Life of Saint Gerard Majella by Reverend O.R. Vassall-Phillips. Chapter 9. His Charity During an Epidemic. Perhaps there was no spot in all southern Italy where Gerard was better known or held in higher esteem than the little town of Lassodogna. Here for 3 long years he had served the hard master whose violent temper had so exercised him in the practice of virtue. Here he had lived in the sight of men and angels a life of heroic sanctity even before his entrance into religion. Here was Gerard's well, recalling by its very name the great miracle of the Bambino worked in reward of Gerard's faith. Whenever, therefore, the servant of God had occasion to visit Lassodogna, he was received with open arms by its inhabitants. And now the little city was in sore distress. A terrible pestilence has invaded its streets. Panic and dismay reigned supreme, while not a few recognized in the visitation which had come upon them so suddenly the divine punishment for notorious scandals that existed in their midst. There was a general demand for Gerard. He, it was felt, could stay the anger of God. The bishop of the place accordingly represented his own desire and that of his people for a visit from the Holy Brother, with the result that the saint was sent by his superiors to Lassodogna. St. Gerard took up his abode with an excellent Christian called Constantine Capucci. This good man and his family were filled with enthusiasm at the sight of the virtues of their guest, especially were they moved by the austerity of life which nothing could hide, and by his exceeding charity. Every day great numbers of persons, priests and laymen, flocked to Capucci's house in order to seek the advice of this holy visitor. Ever full of affability, he was accessible to all. No time was kept by him as his own. His one desire was to be of service to his fellow men. Nor were signs and wonders absent. God glorified his servant before the world, that hearts might be the more docile in his hands. On one occasion, Gerard was with his host and a large number of friends in the picture gallery of the house. Suddenly he went into an ecstasy and was transported off his feet to the level of a picture of the Holy Mother of God that was hanging upon the walls. Then, remaining for some time supernaturally raised in the air, beside himself with love, he cried aloud, "How beautiful she is! How beautiful is Mary!" As he spoke, he covered the picture with rapturous kisses. We may easily imagine the holy confusion he must have experienced when, on coming to himself, he discovered to his dismay that quite a large assembly had thus become witnesses of the divine favors of which he was the recipient. The first person to be cured at Lassodogna was a priest, Canon Sopponiero. He had received the last sacraments and was given over by the doctors when St. Gerard brought him back from the very jaws of death. The worthy canon has himself left us an account of his cure. After describing the complicated nature of his maladies, he proceeds as follows. Quote, "I thought myself on the point of appearing before the judgment seat of God. Having heard of the arrival of the Holy Brother, I had myself recommended to his powerful prayers. What was not my amazement when he sent me word that my illness would not be of long duration, and that all I needed for recovery was complete confidence in God. I might then still hope, and when he visited me the next day I cried out, 'Praise be the Lord.' He answered me, 'Rejoice, you are cured.' Then he came close up to me and made on my forehead the sign of the cross. At once I found myself perfectly well. I should have risen that moment had he not enjoined upon me to wait for the morrow. Glory be to God and to his servant." End quote. By the sign of the Holy Cross he cured many persons. Thus he succeeded in restoring to her former state of health a young girl called Lila Coccia, who for some months previously had been the victim of a terrible form of madness. St. Gerard knew Lila of old, and on one of his former visits to Lassodogna she had come to him, inconsolable with grief, and asked him about the soul of her mother, for whose recent death she was then mourning. The saint had received a divine light, by which he was able to tell her that her mother was in purgatory, but that she would be delivered if her daughter would offer 40 communions for her eternal repose. She did as she was asked, and after making the communions, her mother appeared to her, thanked her, and told her that she was on her way to heaven. Gerard remembered all this, and was grieved indeed to hear of the poor girl's afflicted state. He went straight to her house. On his arrival, according to usual custom, he made the sign of the cross, and at once she recovered the use of her reason. The recovery was both complete and permanent. Such favors as these, published as they were throughout the city, were most effectual in persuading all to listen to the spiritual admonitions of God's holy servant. It was said of him that he had but to look at a sinner, and he could do what he pleased with him. Soon the whole face of the little city was changed. Scandals disappeared. The grace of God triumphed on every side. We will here mention one of the most remarkable of the conversions effected at this time by St. Gerard. There was a man dying at Lassodogna, whose conscience was loaded with sins. Standing on the threshold of eternity, he had rejected the advances of priest after priest who had had the charity to proffer him the consolations of religion. The whole town was horror-stricken at the spectacle of his obduracy. As everything else had failed, Gerard was at length brought to his bedside. Having first cast one glance at the sick man, he immediately fell to his knees, and turning to her whom we all love to salute in the hope of the hopeless, said aloud one Hail Mary. He then rose and turned to address the poor sinner. But grace had already done its blessed work. Gerard's look, Gerard's voice, above all Gerard's prayer, had won the day at last. Satan was driven, routed from the field. The dying man asked earnestly for a priest, and was happily reconciled with his eternal judge. Whilst he was at Lassodogna, many sick persons were brought to the saint from Vassall, a little town in the immediate neighborhood, that, if it so pleased God, they might be released from their maladies. But such inhabitants of Vassall as were suffering from the prevalent epidemic could not bear the journey to Lassodogna. Gerard, on his side, had the heart of a mother for the sick and the miserable. He could not listen to the tale of so much suffering and remain untouched. Accordingly, in deference to repeated entreaties, he went to Vassall. Although he could not remain there for any length of time, his stay, short as it was, proved to be full of blessings for the people of the place. Many were the sick persons whom he restored to health. A case which deserves a special mention is that of Bartholomew Melchior. Shortly after his marriage, this poor man fell into some species of consumption. One effect of this illness was that he seemed to have lost the right use of his reason. He was given over to an evil spirit of gloom and dark despair that settled on him like a cloud of darkness. The unfortunate being had been taken by his friends to a shrine of St. Anthony, but the great St. Anthony in heaven had remained deaf to their appeals, wishing to reserve the work of mercy for a saint on earth. As soon as Gerard looked on the poor sufferer, he addressed him cheerfully in a tone of confidence. "It is nothing, my friend, it is nothing." He then said a few prayers, his hand gently resting on the head of Bartholomew, who was cured on the spot. Once more, he was a man sound both in mind and in body. The epidemic had now abated its violence, and Gerard returned quietly to Elisito, having accomplished his appointed work after the manner and with the power of a saint. Virtue had gone out from him, for he walked with God and was perfect.